for coming to this discussion. Like my good colleague Deb said, how can you still discuss this issue after all these years? Well, the reason is very simple. The reason we still discuss it is because we haven't found a solution. And as long as we haven't found a solution, I think we have to address the question. You know, the objective of the panel is to define a new approach towards development in the WTO negotiations, and actually broader, of what is needed in an inclusive multilateral system to enable the development of the poorer members. You know, the issue of development has been at the core of these negotiations, whatever people say. I mean, it is basically the elephant in the room of the negotiations. Nobody addresses the issue systemically. We always say, we need that and that because we are developing countries, or no, you cannot have that and that because you are no longer a developing country. But to know exactly what is needed in development, or what the differentiation issue means, or how it could be addressed, is not really discussed in the WTO. So we thought it was necessary to have a brainstorming session on this issue with people who are not negotiators. We don't have any negotiators here, because the negotiators just repeat whatever they say in terms of their interests, and that's not very useful. So we have tried to have a panel of people who are not negotiators, but have one characteristic which is important. They all have been working in the real world, that means in the economy, and so on, and they all have had a distinguished career in interests in public policy and the public good. And I think that is very important, because we need people who are actually in the ground doing the job, getting their hands dirty, to know what you need for development. And at the same time, we need people who are actually interested in the public good and policy issues. So what I wanted to say here at the beginning, and you know, my colleague Joseph has told, you know, please be short. You have a tendency of being much too long, and that's true. I wanted just to give the framework of the discussion. I think among the panelists, there is nobody who puts into question that the governance of the global trade system should contribute to the development of all its members. I think we all agree that development is the final goal. It's not the goal of WTO. WTO and trade is a means to get to development. Secondly, nobody, I think, questions the principle that poor developing countries need special conditions to take into account their structural and administrative obstacles to integrate into the world economy. That's very important. We do realize that one shoe doesn't fit everybody. And thirdly, nobody questions that sustainable development requires integration into the world economy, and that, that it is not a goal. The trade is necessary, but not a goal in itself, but it's a means to achieve development. However, what all that means and how to make rules that are creating an enabling environment for the poorer members is largely questions. I think even though there is a lot of question, we all agree on certain things. First of all, the traditional approach to special and differential treatment has not delivered as much as it could, especially for the poorest. Secondly, special and differential treatment has to be revisited given the changes in the world economy, in particular the global value chains, and also given the present political environment. But the need for an enabling environment for the poorer countries is not in question. They do need structural changes, they do need industrialization, and they do need for that an enabling environment internationally. It's not enough. The internal policies are very important, but that's not our subject here. We are looking at the international environment. We have a very distinguished panel here today to discuss this issue. And I really would like to quickly introduce them. Next to me is Mr. Debapriya Bhattacharya. Very difficult to say, but everybody knows him under the name of Deb. which is much easier. He is a distinguished fellow of the Center of the Policy Dialogue, which he actually created and was the first executive director. He was an ambassador at the WTO in the name for Bangladesh, and he's a senior Fulbright fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. He's the chair of the Southern Voice on Post-MDG International Development Goals and the chair of the LDC4 Monitor. Very welcome. He has, by the way, he has published recently a book, which he has never sent to me, and I haven't seen, on the Southern perspectives on post-2015 international development agenda. I urge you to send me a copy so that I can read it. I'm sure it's very interesting.
It depends how you end this discussion.
Okay, I won't get a copy. The second person to my left is Peter Draper. He is the managing director of Tatwa, which is a firm on policy issues and also on enterprises for their for their export markets. He is a senior research fellow at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He is partly a lecturer in a business school. He's a board member in various organizations, and he's very also prominent in the work of the WEF in Geneva or in Davos, and has extensively defended the position of South Africa in a completely different way than his government. The fourth person on my left is Pedro de Camargo Neto. He is a trade and agricultural consultant. He's the president of various agribusiness and associations. He worked for the Minister of Agriculture, and he was involved in the negotiations on agriculture, so he knows perfectly well the issues. He has published many articles, and he's all over the world. But what really is interesting is that he then finally says that he's a rancher and farmer in Sao Paulo. You know, all my farmers in Switzerland say we are the only ones who can never be away. But he has never been in Brazil, and he's still a rancher and a farmer. So I think he has a lot of experience in the issues that we are looking at here, and he has also a spirit of having a free spirit of seeing what he thinks and what he believes. The last but not least, we have Dr. Naushad Forbes. He is the chairman of Forbes Marshall, a steam engineering and control instrument company. He is a lecturer and a consulting professor he was a lecturer and consulting professor at Stanford for 14 years, actually teaching technology in newly industrialized countries, which I think is a topic that comes up all the time, of the role of technology in development. He is on the boards of many educational institutions and companies. And last but not least, he is an active member of the Chamber of Commerce of India and its past president. So welcome also to him for this discussion. Now, basically, what I'm trying to do here is to have a little discussion on the issues that we are addressing in WTO. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to speak, first of all, what has happened with the special and differential treatment, and what was good and what was bad and what can be changed. Secondly, how they have to be adapted to the new environment, both economically and politically. And thirdly, what do countries need to industrialize, developing countries to industrialize, especially industrialization as a large term, not only just manufacturing, but basically creating the internal environment to be able to grow, to climb up the value chain. And last but not least, what does differentiation mean among developing countries? Is it necessary? Is it possible? And how we can address it. So I will now give the floor to my friend Deb to start this discussion and to make sure that we are all going to disagree with him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. I think only this is what I call this, an optimist, hard optimist like you can call a session like this on the very first day and the very first session of a ministerial meeting. That's really, really very, very symptomatic in certain ways. You have mentioned that how you have, I do not disagree with anything what you have, till now you have said. I will start disagreeing as we move forward. Let me first put the whole thing in the perspective, as it is early in the morning today, the first day of the ministerial meeting, that we are dealing with a totally changed circumstances, totally different context. So can we really discuss old issues in the new context in the same way as we used to discuss before? So the approach to this issue, as you have presented it, sounds a bit prehistoric to me. I'm very sorry about it. Because you have a look at what is happening at this very moment. We are having the international trading system suffering from serious hiccups. I won't elaborate. This is a very informed audience. They know much better than I do. I can go on talking about that. The second is the WTO negotiations are going nowhere. That's also true. And the third, in fact, the WTO as an institution is in crisis with the appellate division recent problems. So you have crisis, if not credibility challenge, at very three levels: international trading system, WTO negotiations, and three, the WTO institution as a whole. So within these three levels of crisis or credibility gap, how can you really discuss one certain dimension of the negotiations or had been the foregone negotiations in certain ways in the old way as we used to discuss before? What is differentiation? What do they need more? You know, all these approaches I don't find it any more relevant at all, because the whole negotiation agenda, including SNDT, remains totally out of focus at this very moment. So if the context is not really the supportive one, it is not very useful in discussing all these things in relation to the rest of the things. Now that you are a good friend, you insist that we discuss, I will discuss now that. So the first and foremost, I also take issue with the theme of the discussion, which is different development interest, which is obviously much bigger than this whole differentiation issue, policy space issue, or for that matter, any market access related issues. It's a much bigger issue over here, the development interest. And similarly, you do allude to the politics along with economics over there, so that makes life more complicated. So within that, let me put it in a certain way. So one way of looking at it is that where we left out in July 2009 when we did the last mini-ministerial, that was the death of in certain ways, the Doha round negotiations. And thereafter, there had been not much over there. We selected some SNDT, we went, took it back, and etc. So we can discuss those things, go on over there as running a stationary bicycle, but I don't find that's a good use of our energy. And then there are new issues over there where we can also discuss how the development dimensions can be really put into place, whether it is e-commerce, whether it is fishery subsidies, or anything else for that matter. And then there is the other issue, that is life outside WTO. What is possibly the real one? Because there is a tendency in Rue de Lausanne, that in a certain building, that to think that the trade only evolves around the WTO mechanism. But since the last meetings during the last 2-3 years, you and Peter on my left side, do I get these two people on the two right sides, I hope, that they have been telling me we should be all learning how to join the plurilateral. I don't dare to ask what happened to your plurilaterals in between with TPP and others in between. So in the meantime, these countries have learned how to do also sub-regional cooperation through connectivity and other issues. And they have gone for a lot of bilaterals within themselves around the region. So as you see that during the last couple of years, there's significant growth in regional cooperative arrangements in Africa, in Asia, in different parts of Asia, and partly also in Latin America. So, and people had been, the countries have been also trying to get into this game through other kinds of South-South cooperation mechanism, including RCEP and others. So we have a much more diverse landscape, changing landscape in terms of trade flow and trading arrangements over there. So I think it will be useful also to take cognizance of those things which are happening while we discuss these things. And we see whether they are putting in the best practice what we have agreed in the WTO till now, but have not negotiated and got into a dealings over there. I take back also to the very fundamental things, changes which has happened in this world, apart from the other things, protectionist measures, the populism which we see, or you call Brexit, Catalonia, and if we can talk about also the TTIP and etc. We had the SDGs in between 2 years back, which possibly, and you will see one of the major issues where everybody agreed, including all the big countries, is that to defend an open, rule-based, multilateral trading system and non-discriminatory one. I think that is one particular principle where we have reduced ourselves now. So if you want to talk about development interests, let us first talk about the system. It is not which is development concerns are at stake. It is the international development mechanism is at stake, which is no more agreed to be or complied by big countries to be open, rule-based, non-discriminatory, multilateral. So that is one of the starting points what we get to. On the Doha round, you see, we are now in a paradoxical situation that one of the kingpin of the demands of the LDCs had been duty-free, quota-free market access. Now, what we do here, that due to Hong Kong declaration, that it will be only resolved when Doha round is resolved. And Doha round is never going to be resolved. So you see what a paradoxical thing, you had chicken and egg situation you have got into us. And that is the other point over there. After that, we also agreed on the services waivers. Some countries have notified, but they're meaningless. These are essentially the most favored nation status declaration which have been put into their submission or notifications over there. In between, we did have the trade facilitation agreement. Yes, it was a progress. We all agree. We have these ABCs over there, but what is going to be? How do you really fund those Cs over there with Aid for Trade? And colleagues for Aid for Trade will tell you they really did not raise the adequate amount of money for that kind of things over there. So I can go on this, and my whole point over here is that we are dealing with a fundamentally changed circumstances. And if you want to talk about differentiation in these circumstances, it will sound a bit out of context. But even if you want to have a differentiation issue being discussed, yes, we can all agree that the differentiation in the SNDT can be thought of. We have recently done these negotiations in New York, where we have discussed not SNDT, we have discussed CBDR, the Common But Differentiated Responsibility, the other, brother of SNDT in certain ways in international negotiation. And we agreed on certain issues, particularly in climate change issues. And we can really bring those things, very innovative ways of solving this kind of problems. We can think of time-bound SNDT. We can think of sectoral approach to the SNDT. We can think of even a treaty on SNDT. But how far can we take our ambition when even those 5 men and women who have been appointed in the last 24 hours cannot agree on a certain statement which may not be approved totally by the whole membership? So I think what we are now dealing with a fundamental systemic concern, which concerns not the SNDT as a system, or within the system, but the system itself. So if the system itself is there, the solutions will come in the alternatives and also the ways people really go and do that. And at a very high cost on all sides. That is the unfortunate part of it. So I have attended personally almost all the ministerials within and outside. I had been, and if you talk about Seattle and Cancun, I think Buenos Aires remains possibly more critically poised today than all those days we had behind. I am very sorry that on a Monday morning, you have provoked me to say these things. Thank you.
I'm very happy I provoked you to say those things. Thank you very much. You know, I do actually agree with everything that you've said, except that you have interpreted what we are doing here in a small way, which I don't do. I fully agree that we have to, that's what I mean by redefine the interests of the developing countries, taking into account exactly those changes that happened. You answered the question, is the present system, the way we were looking at getting preferences for developing countries, DFQF and things like that, is useless. And it is useless, unfortunately, the way it's done now. So we got to define new issues. Yeah. When you say we need a multilateral, open, non-discriminatory system, I think we all agree, but the issue is that people don't believe anymore that the way we have actually now divided the world is any more relevant, and that we have to look at proportional responsibilities for the system or whatever it is. And we got to address this issue. The problem that you mentioned is that those 5 persons up there, they do not directly address these issues. And that's what I think is bad. We got to address it. You said there are ways of looking at it, product specific or whatever. Let's do it.
Yeah, will you give me 10 seconds more?
Yes, I do.
I think that one of the points we should all remember, that the problem is solved by itself. Because you see, within the next 10 years, according to our predictions, there will be hardly any LDCs in the South, in Asia. There will be a handful of LDCs only left in Africa. It will be an Africanization of the LDCs. And if the LDCs really vanish in the next 10, 15 years, and I don't see Doha round really resolving itself in the next 10, 15 years, or if not later, then you will have a totally new ways of looking at differentiation, where all the not only the LDCs will be reduced in number, but the low-income countries are also reducing in number. Low-income countries, most of them by the next 10 years will become low, middle-income country. So you have a totally new composition of the developing countries, which we will be dealing with the new dimensions and new implications.
That's right.
So that's another changing landscape I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
There are always going to be latecomers and people ahead, whatever the discrimination is. But I think that's a good point of discussion. Let's go on and give the word to Peter Draper.
Okay, thanks, Nicolas. It's difficult to know where to pick up after that.
That was the purpose.
Yeah, so I think a couple of points of agreement with both of you. I think the trade landscape has changed fundamentally. We're dealing with a very different world. And in that context, SDT, I think, is quite challenging to think about. And I agree with Deb that it is largely becoming an African problem. If you look at all the projections of economic growth 30 years out and where poverty will be concentrated by 2035, it's largely going to be a South Asian and a sub-Saharan African problem. So that offers one potential way of thinking about differentiation into the future. Assuming we inherit a system that actually works, that everybody subscribes to, and I think this is the point that Deb was really getting at. It's not clear that we're all on the same page when it comes to these things. I thought what I would do is start by taking us back a bit, in a sense, into history, into the nature of the original compromise that gave rise to the WTO. And you might recall the work of a very famous international relations scholar, John Ruggie. He described it as the embedded liberalism compromise. And so always at the heart of the essentially Western construction of the WTO was the idea that the Western democracies which drove the system agreed to yield certain prerogatives at the multilateral level, originally the GATT, and to liberalize and converge their policies progressively, so giving up policy space, if you like, in order to achieve a greater benefit, which was constructing the multilateral system. And the reason that was important was because of the history of what gave rise to the Second World War. So it was precisely to avoid that kind of global conflagration in a nuclear weapons age. And that's quite important to remember, given everything that's going on the Korean Peninsula, in the Middle East, etc., etc. And in a sense, we seem to be slipping back into a kind of age of geopolitical competition where there is a lot at stake. And the WTO still remains, I think, a key pillar of that post-World War II liberal international economic order. And I use the term deliberately. It's the liberal international economic order because it was founded essentially on Western liberalism. So what kind of world do we confront today, Deb? Well, we confront a world where the United States, at least certain parts of it and certain leaders in the United States, are taking a different tack. They've, in fact, questioned the entire foundation of that order. And if you listen carefully to what President Trump and others in his administration are saying, I take them to be saying essentially two things. One is that they need policy space, actually. They need policy space in order to discriminate against foreigners. In effect, they're asking for special and differential treatment, but it's of a very different kind, right? The other thing they're saying is that it's a bad deal. And President Trump says this about every trade deal he sees, and just about every other kind of deal, including North Korea and others. And so he wants to change the terms of the deal, but from a policy space perspective. Now, if you take that to its logical conclusion, every country in the world, it seems to me, wants policy space to do what it can in terms of pursuing its own development. If every country were free to pursue its own policy space, very quickly, I think we would not have a WTO. We would not have a multilateral trading system, which then takes me back to the importance of that embedded liberalism compromise, which is the idea that countries have to progressively give up certain things in order to maintain the system, and not just maintain it, but to keep it moving forward. And I could remind you of the bicycle theory that Geneva trade diplomats used to talk about quite often. If you don't keep moving forward, the bicycle falls over. And that's the point at which we're at. I think there's a real threat that the bicycle may fall over. So we have a big problem when it comes to the geopolitics, and particularly the engagement of, in essence, the founder of the system, which is the United States. So that's one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is, I think we don't have shared understandings of what development means. And I want to relate that particularly to the global value chain story, something that I'm sure Deb can speak quite passionately about. But from where I'm sitting, my vantage point in South Africa, where there's been a lot of debate about this issue, there are essentially two perspectives, and I'll describe them very simply. One I would call a facilitative perspective, and this is the idea that basically we should open up our markets, promote liberal policies, provide good infrastructure, strong intellectual property protection, strong investor protections, etc. And the multinationals will come, they will invest, and through various linkage effects, they will promote development, right? So particularly low-wage, labor-intensive development, which is a view that I largely subscribe to, but not without some reservations. And if that's your view, then that lends a particular policy perspective, and it also lends a particular approach to your WTO engagements. If I think, for instance, of the countries in the Pacific Alliance, I would say this is the perspective they largely subscribe to. I think many East Asian countries largely subscribe to this perspective, with some significant exceptions, perhaps China, and I'll come back to China shortly. And so those countries that subscribe to this perspective, I think, are quite keen to forge new rules that frame this new environment and to promote liberalization wherever possible. If you subscribe to the second point of view, which I would call the restrictive perspective, you have a very different approach. And I think this is certainly the South African government's approach, at least in the trade ministry. It's not shared across all government departments. And that is the idea that we will condition multinationals coming into our market through, for instance, local content provisions or intellectual property provisions. So you must give up certain intellectual property if you're going to invest in our market, or strong government procurement protections for locals, and so on and so forth. So quite a different way of thinking about the value chains narrative. Now, if that's your ideological framework, now when you come to the WTO, you come to protect, because that's the framework that you're protecting. And I think you see those frameworks showing up in the G90 paper that we were talking about, even though I haven't read it. I understand that's the logic behind the G90 paper. And that lends a very different approach to how you think about, well, the WTO in general, but special and differential treatment in particular, I would suggest. Then I think there's another emerging challenge that's linked to this framing, or my framing of the GVC's debate, and that is that if I were, let's say, a typical LDC sub-Saharan African country looking at the menu of development options out there, and in the past I would typically look at the US, Europe, maybe a couple of Latin American countries, but increasingly China. And in sub-Saharan Africa, if one looks at a country like Ethiopia, for example, I think they've really gone the China route in many ways. So democracy is not a requirement. In fact, authoritarian governments is the preference. So strong state-led development, conditional policies for multinationals, but certainly attracting them in, looking to leverage labor-intensive possibilities that are undoubtedly there in the Ethiopian case. And I think increasingly African countries are asking themselves which are the better models to follow. Is it the Western model? Is it the Chinese model? Some form of state capitalism? And if it's the state capitalist route, is that approach, that ideological preference, compatible with a liberal international economic order? I think that's the fundamental challenge, in a sense, that the WTO faces. And it may or may not be compatible, I'm not sure. So President Xi, in his 3-hour speech to the Chinese Communist Party Congress, said very clearly that China is moving to the center, China is ready to lead, and we are, in essence, selling our development approach. I think it would be great if China did step up to lead the WTO in the vacuum left behind that President Trump has vacated. But the real question is, what kind of leadership would China provide, and in what direction, and what kind of economic model? And is that compatible with progressive liberalization? So where does state capitalism in general reside in the liberal international economic order? For me, that's the fundamental tension at the heart of where we are. And I don't think Buenos Aires is going to resolve this. I think where we are at is we are in an interregnum period, where the old order is dying and the new order has yet to be born. And in this interregnum period, we really don't know what the future of special and differential treatment is, which is not to say it's an unimportant question to ask. I think it's a very important question to ask, but I really don't know where we're going, and so I find it very difficult to answer the question. Having said that, I think where it does point us, and I'll conclude on these points, I do think it points us in the speed, or in the direction of a multi-speed WTO, where these different kinds of preferences have some possibility of being reflected, and the system could move forward in part. That is plurilaterals, for sure. So Pacific Alliance countries, like-minded countries, if they want to move ahead on certain things, I think they should have the policy space to do so. Those that don't want to move ahead, that poses a bigger challenge, but it's not obvious to me that we can or should be imposing certain preferences on them in terms of policy choices. So differentiation, I think, ending finally on that point, is part of this debate. But differentiation is more than just about exactly what your current set of development indicators are. So differentiation has tended to be defined that way. LDCs, clearly, separate category. I think everybody agrees we need to do something for LDCs. There's an LDC package. It's varying implementation or varying in, possibilities, but at least there's agreement. We must do something for LDCs. But what about all the rest? Small island developing states, for instance. Do they deserve a separate category all of their own? And there's a range of other kinds of categories. Should we just be lumping all developing countries into one basket? I don't think so at all. And a country like Singapore, in my mind, is not even a developing country. China, well, yes and no. It's both developed and developing. Where does a country like South Africa fit? Is it possible to come up with a set of objective criteria by which you could categorize SDT? It's been tried before, by the way. I remember at the beginning of the Doha round, Christopher Stevens, who was then at the ODI, he actually came up with quite a rigorous set of objective criteria to do precisely this, and it was largely ignored just because politically it's too difficult, I think, to go that route. So sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but hopefully I answered some of your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I think it is, the issue is a ramble issue that we have to address. But I just hold two or three things back from that. You said that there is no shared understanding of development, which I believe is at the crux of the things. We cannot have a multilateral system if we don't have a vision, I think, of what this means. And therefore, I think the issue is not a historical dinosaur issue. The second point I wanted to make is differentiation. We should not, I believe, we should not only see it in terms of giving preferences to somebody. It's what is the place of each country in terms of its obligations or its contribution to the public good of a system that works? And I think that's a very important question. And the third one is, I think you made very good the point that is the system, the way it is today, is the liberal system which was imposed on system that comes up with the state enterprises. I mean, the China thing that you mentioned. And the question is not really which system that we choose, because I think everybody should have the right to have the system they want. But how are they compatible so that one system does not hurt the other one, or give an equal deficit? So these are basic questions that we have to address if we want to have a multilateral system that works. And I'm sure Pedro has something to say on that.
Well, thank you, Nicolas. Thank you for the invitation. An honor to be here on the table with such distinguished speakers. Well, I think the issue of development that you start is such large and larger than Buenos Aires. And I'll try to not only it's just too large, and I'm not prepared to talk about all of the aspects, and I wouldn't have it even a chance to do it in 10 minutes. I'll try to stay in Buenos Aires in the Ministerial Conference on this multilateral trade system that we have here and we have seen that it developed, which is I would say, a small part of what is necessary for development. It should help. It should not be a burden, but it basically treats debts and subsidies. But that is certainly a small portion of what is necessary for development, which the larger portion comes on domestic policy decisions, which one instrument which is extremely powerful, such as taxes, are not even treated here directly, and the way countries tax have an immense influence on how development goes, and they have policy space for that, and we have seen many developing countries doing exactly the opposite, what would be a good tax structure for development. So we're talking here of what WTO creates as a burden, and or should not create as a burden, and which should create as a help, assistance on that. And that comes special differentiation treatment, which understanding that not only we have countries with different development levels, different income levels, countries that have been of minor participation in the process of the rules we have now, that we have creating rules, more rules, every such and such in time, every rounds, and the rules are being created, and the rules have been more or less, I wouldn't say imposed by developed world, but with an extremely strong influence of the developed world. And then when you come and develop, you end up accepting these rules, and you have the separate differential treatment and how these rules. I think that's an important issue, because particularly I'm them that have always followed, looking from also a smaller portion of it through agriculture. And which here supposedly we're talking about domestic subsidies, which is limitations on that, which is basically a rule of the WTO. The difference between what is applied on a domestic policy like that is very large, very important. And the developed world has a completely different system of domestic policy. They're permitted many things that now they don't want the others to do. Is this fair? Of course it's not fair. Fairness is every country should have the ability to develop their system, develop their rules, develop their policies, which probably will require subsidies and probably will require a tax structure. And I think this is very difficult to be against a fair system. And the WTO has not been able to treat this in all these years. Huh? Of course, I think the accident we are right now, of course, the institution of the WTO is being challenged very strongly, as has been put. It's more an accident, or maybe if the accident had not happened, we would probably going that way, because we have been unable to understand and develop the rules that are necessary. I mean, Doha has 15 years, and what have we? Just as an example again, from my perspective, which was the cotton case. I mean, and it has been in every ministerial, and we still have no solution. There's a rule that was supposed to follow, a rule that's not being followed, and a rule that is promised to be followed, and what maximum you get on a ministerial is a promise to treat it again on the next ministerial. So how can a system a rules-based system that not follow the rules can be strengthened with that type of attitude? So we were heading for a problem anyway, and then we had the accident. I think, and in an accident period, I think it's not a period that you are going to be able to develop much. And we are here. We are all here. I mean, we're here because we want to be sure we survive this accident period, and we again come with a more understanding and more multilateralism and more understanding of each other's and others' problems, and permitting that each other's develop their own policy and come wherever. I think that's why we are here, because we're not expecting anything from this accident period. How are we going to get there? How long it will take? I don't know, but hopefully maybe plurilateralism will help, because it has become so difficult to obtain consensus on such a large number of countries in this period that maybe plurilateralism will help. And if it can help, like-minded countries can be able to develop, and through that, maybe we can revolve. I believe that's a route, but I'm not. But there are issues that are still very important to have a multilateral and a consensus approach, and after this period will have to come. Special differential treatment will always be a perspective, even though countries are developing, are becoming richer. There's always a phase. They're not all the same. The issues that we're going to be in 10 years, 15 years are not the ones we're thinking right now. Everything is happening so fast that we will have to, and by experience of historical perspective, developed world, the ones that are ahead will again come here to try to make us accept what is of their interest, which is not the way we should do. We should permit that everyone reaches on their speed and help them create a speed for whatever development will come in the next 15 years, which I think it's going to be very different. There are many issues that are happening so fast that I think we cannot, WTO is certainly just too slow, just too slow. If you look at what happened with agricultural trade since Punta del Este, 400 kilometers from here, when the agricultural agreement was started, no one could imagine. 90% of what happened with agriculture has nothing to do with WTO. And so maybe in the next 30 years, we'll have another many developments that have nothing to do with WTO. But we are here because we believe in a multilateral trade system. We are here because we understand that the rules cannot be the same for everyone. The rules have to respect differences. And we have not been able very much to do that in an efficient way. But we shouldn't put all the fault in WTO. I think a big part of the fault is own domestic policies, which have been unable to utilize all the capabilities they could and the experience they could see. But that's another issue which is out of our forum. Our forum is very limited. Our forum is multilateral trade rules. And a special differentiation in this perspective. And differentiation has to happen. And it's not black and white. I mean, they're all shades of different development. There are shades on sectors. There are shades on countries. There are which we have been unable to understand and adapt. Have we been unable to understand, or is there will to understand, or is it simpler to maintain the black and white? You know, I think it's simpler to maintain in black and white because it's complex. It's a complex issue, and we have been unable to solve the simple issues. I think that it is a pity, but it's true. We have been unable, and I again go to the cotton example. How come we're still here? The first ministerial, Doha was development round. Then in Cancun, cotton was a big issue. Hong Kong, there's a ministerial was a big issue. 15 years. And here it's not going to be an issue because there's no big issue. Or it would be a big issue again. So I think it's this lack of being able to solve these simple issues, the simple issues, that has put us in where we are. Has put us where we are, and I think the good part is remembering after Punta del Este, agriculture changed a lot. Has nothing to do with WTO, and I think in 30 years a lot will change again, for better. As we just mentioned, Southeast Asia is increasing, Latin America is increasing, independent of WTO. Fortunately, because WTO is just too slow to understand the problems and come with solutions that we all need. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. I start to believe or to feel that you guys are all becoming very negative and looking at the world, you know, through very dark glasses. You know, we are in a transition period, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to look at how we can get out of that transition period. It's very difficult to solve issues at that period, I agree. But we got to look at what we can do to get out of this transition period.
You know which way is the transition? You know which way is the transition?
Yes, I think we know the general trend of where the transition is going. We do know that. I think we do. You mentioned some of it, the importance of South-South trade, etc. But you know, we are talking now. Everybody seems to be saying, "Let's go plurilaterals." Yes, because there is a problem. But plurilaterals are a big problem too. Because basically you will have only the interests of the big trading powers, because they will make plurilaterals. They will define the rules for them. We're going back to GATT, where it's a small group that is going to make the rules for everybody. We need rules for the plurilaterals, how we go about the plurilaterals.
But Nicolas,
no, I mean, I
here,
don't accept that.
The rules were made by the big partners. WTO, the rules that exist in GATT and WTO are the rules that were made by the developed world.
That's right.
That's right. I just said they changed opinion.
And that's why
they
we
didn't
made
follow
the
the rules. But the rules were made by them. When I see Washington complaining about WTO, my experience that the rules in WTO were made by Washington. Of course, not alone, but a big portion of them.
That's definitely, but you might forget that we created the WTO in Marrakesh, which was supposed to actually change that and make it a system for everybody. And now you abandon on it.
No,
you're going back to plurilaterals.
If we abandon, we wouldn't be here. We're here knowing that nothing's going to happen. But we are here, not to abandon.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to go on. Last but not least, Dr. Forbes. I think there is also one issue that we have not discussed that is put up, especially by the African countries, you know, that as a matter of fact, you know, industrialization, its longer term, in its large sense, is not possible in the liberal system. And all the countries who are developed or the emerging countries have actually had other systems to develop. And I would like to see what you think. How do you develop an industrialization in a liberal system?
Sure. So, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me approach the question from two perspectives. First, from the perspective of our firm as an Indian firm, and what role tariffs and the special and differential access that India had for many years led to the development of our own firm and its own capabilities. And second, from the perspective of technical capability, and building technical capabilities, which, as you mentioned, is sort of used to be my academic field, and how countries in both the developing and developed world continue to use significant direct state policies to foster building technical capabilities. Good. So just a quick comment first on our own firm. You know, India had very high tariffs through to 1991, as you all know. We as a firm benefited from those tariffs. We benefit from those tariffs in being able to build technical capabilities in our own firm and competences in our own firm that meant that by 1991, we didn't need them. But in 1991, the tariffs on almost all the products that we made then, tariffs were typically around 400%. So we were highly protected. And in that highly protected environment, we were able to develop wide and deep capabilities covering many different product ranges. Since 1991, the tariffs have progressively come down, and today, all the products that we make are duty-free in terms of there are no tariffs on any of those products for anyone who wishes to import them into the Indian market. So we see this change that's taken place as being very powerful, very productive. It was very valuable to us in our early days of establishing our own capabilities and building our own competencies. We don't need them now. So I think the tariffs and the special and differential access that we had as a country earlier on did exactly what it was intended to do, which was to provide infant industry protection for a particular point in time, enable us to build certain capabilities, and at the time, and then later on, I would argue that the tariffs could have been reduced faster and earlier than they actually were, and that we would have benefited, and the Indian economy would have benefited if the tariffs had been reduced faster and earlier than they actually were. But these capabilities that exist today would probably not have existed without those tariffs at that time. And I think that point is useful to keep in mind when we talk about LDCs in Africa. when we talk about countries that are trying to develop their own industrial bases, and which are trying to do so in a very different environment where such policies are no longer seen as acceptable in the multilateral trading system. So I think I'll come back to that point in a minute. The second perspective is the perspective of building technical capability. And I think this is something that countries around the world, developing and developed, and maybe especially developed, have done and continue to do and are only enhancing. So whether you talk about the US, or you talk about the UK, or you talk about Germany, or you talk about Japan, or you talk about Israel, or you talk about South Korea, or you talk about China, all of them, or Singapore, all of them use specific policies to support the development of technical capability in their own economies. Whether it's direct R&D subsidies, whether it's tax breaks for spending on particular R&D areas, whether it's demonstration projects for new technologies, such as new solar technologies, whether it's which are directly funded by the state, whether it's incentives such as weighted deductions, or whether it's, say in the US, very high levels of public R&D for defense R&D, which then has spillovers into the private sector, leading to the development of many areas. And none of these kinds of interventions by the state are, I think, even under discussion in the WTO as are these acceptable interventions or not. They're seen as perfectly acceptable interventions. And I think if we see these as perfectly acceptable interventions, then maybe we can look at the entire area of industrial development for LDCs through that same lens. That why are these acceptable? If these are acceptable, they're acceptable because we are saying subsidies that will later lead to future technical capabilities. That's what tariffs are supposed to do. That's what infant industry protection was indeed supposed to do. So if we have then a lens of seeing the policies that develop future technical capabilities as okay, can we agree a set of rules around what's okay, what's not okay, and then can we generalize those rules to include what LDCs might indeed require to build their own future technical capabilities in their own particular industries. And I think the learnings worldwide on infant industry protection is what's worked. What's worked has been when the tariffs are temporary. They phase out in a particular time frame, however long that is, but there's a defined time frame. Second, that they're selective. They're focused on particular industries that change maybe over time. And third, they're combined actually with the liberalization and opening up of other tariffs so that you have many other sectors which are actually where the global trading system benefits from the greater wealth that's being created through the industrialization of a particular country. So I think if we focus our work on technical capabilities, on what particular policies are in play around the world, in the developed world, actually, more than any other, in the developed world today, and then see how we can generalize those to how we can use have similar kinds of objectives of future industrial development, I think that could be quite powerful. A last comment on development. I think it always makes, I actually like your topic very much, because the point about development interests, I mean, the development is indeed the objective. It's the objective that the trading system should be delivering to both developing countries and developed countries. The challenges that we're hearing coming from Washington and to some extent from the UK today are actually precisely because of struggles with their own future development and struggles with particular groups of people within those countries who sense that they've been left behind in the progress that their own economies have made. So I think the development issues that that we are talking about for developing countries also apply to some of the most developed countries. And I think it's getting the message across again and again and again, even though it's an old message. And I take your point that the that the message of the liberal trading system, the democratic trading system, etc., was the original construct. But getting the message across of the power of that system again and again and again is still worth doing, even if it's old and dismissed by a lot of people. Because at the end of the day, I think as countries grow richer, they buy a lot more of things that make other countries grow richer too. So it's when more and more African countries get richer that they will be able to buy more Boeings and Airbuses. It's when they'll be able to buy more computers and phones. It's when they'll be able to buy more of those goods that support the advertising that keeps Google and Facebook thriving. And it's, I think, getting that basic message across that that if we can address the development needs of countries in a very direct way, we will create an economic system and have an economic system that benefits all, is one that we should keep emphasizing again and again and again.
Thank you very much. May I ask you, since we started, just two questions. The first one is, you basically made the case for infant industry in your specific case, and it has worked in Asia and Southeast Asia, I think. That's a fact. In Latin America, it hasn't worked at all. In Africa, it hasn't worked at all either. Question is why, and what can we do that is? You mentioned, there has to be a time frame and people have to do it, but I think that's not enough. That's one thing. The second point, which is even more important for me, is the system in a global value chain where you protect the sector, possible still to do it? Or is that a policy that worked in the 90s but not today?
So on the first point, why does infant industry protection, why has it worked in particular areas and not in others? Why has it been particularly successful in, let's say, South Korea? I mean, would be probably the poster child of infant industry protection in the 60s and 70s as they moved to more and more sophisticated industries, and very successfully and very effectively over a 20 or 30-year transition of industrial development and progress. And why has it worked less well in Latin America? I'd argue that it has worked in Latin America in certain sectors. It's worked, for example, in the auto sector. You could argue that the development, for example, of the auto component industry in Mexico, the auto component industry to some extent in Brazil, are examples of success in developing an industry around initial infant industry protection and around initial local content regulations. And that gave the actual base for that industry to subsequently integrate with global value chains in the auto component industry. And it wouldn't have actually started without that initial period of protection for a couple of decades, actually, throughout Latin America. The more interesting question is, why did the industry develop successfully in Mexico and in Brazil and less successfully in Argentina? That's a different question, for the auto component industry in particular.
Can I add a Latin American version? I'm not a specialist on that, but the way I see it, it was very important for the beginning. Not the 30s, the 40s. We have an industry, a manufacturing industry, strong, diversified. But then you start with the protection, and you maintain it too long.
No, I agree.
The error is that this has to be for a period.
Yes.
You have to phase out. And it's easy to start, and it's difficult to phase out. And what we have been unable to do correctly is the phasing out. And we still have a problem. We still have a problem that we still have sectors which are extremely protected for a century or half a century, which there's no significance. I mean, infant after 50 years, and the industry changing, technology changed, nothing to do with what the protection was started, and we have been unable to. So this phasing out is the big issue. Then you get strongholds not to phase out, and here we are.
But I agree with you entirely. Infant industry protection, to be successful, I mean, I think the lessons are very clear from economic history. They have to be temporary, yes. And they have to be determined and temporary, and specified in advance. Right. And at the end of the day, it's one of these things where, you know, when people will tell you that, well, government and industry should be close to each other, they actually shouldn't.
Yes.
You know, speaking as someone from industry, my view would always be that governments should listen to industry, listen sympathetically to industry as well, and then ignore it ultimately in terms of the actual delivery of the opening out that's required. Your example of 50 years of protection is exactly right. Take the garment industry. You know, why does the EU still need tariffs on garments after 200 years? I mean, it's, you know, there are tariffs of, say, 10 or 12% that apply to garment exports from India into the EU. You know, I mean, under what circumstances can one argue that an infant industry, you know, is a 200-year-old industry?
That's social policy.
That's a sunset argument.
Yeah,
not an infant industry.
So,
that is special and differential treatment to the OECD countries. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
well,
that will be also in case of agriculture. So
yes, exactly. So, you know, so it's so I think there are areas like that where, and by the way, you know, if the tariff wasn't there, it wouldn't actually result in any industry. There's no industry left. There's no garment industry left, essentially, in Europe today. It only creates imbalances and differences between developing countries that garments are imported from, as opposed to protecting anything at home. So I think, you know, there are areas like this which are wins that are possible to have in the global trading system here and now under the existing rules.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that was very useful. We are getting towards the things. I just wanted to put two questions still out. Yes, I've seen. One is, you know, we are in a transition period. We all agree. The transition period is two things. One is the rising power of new economic powers, but it's also the change of policies in the US, etc. And it seems to me, you know, what has W done in the past? It has gotten a system into place, and then it integrated Europe, and then it integrated Japan, and now we try to integrate China, you know, and it doesn't work anymore because China has another philosophy, the state enterprises. So it seems to me the transition period will only stop once we have found a way of how the state enterprise model and the liberal model can live together and not mutually make it difficult for the commerce. So that seems to me a basic question that we have to address. And we're not going to do that over plurilaterals. The second point is this policy space that you say that everybody wants and everybody needs, which is true. But, you know, I think we all agree, and that's the WTO, that the policy space that I have is limited by the policy space that the other has, you know, and we do need some rules for everybody, which are the same for everybody. How they are applied differently, maybe, according to capacities, but the rules are the same or have to be the same for everybody. So we want to get out of this transition period. We want to have a system that is multilateral. What can we do to help to get over this period as quick as possible? Get rid of Trump? Yes, but that's not sufficient.
I didn't hear you. What did you say?
Get rid of Trump, but that's not sufficient.
I didn't fully hear you. What did you say?
Okay, please. Yes, you.
I wanted to comment on China to Mr. Draper's presentation. I was at the APEC WTO summit, and the last two speakers were Trump and Xi Jinping. Trump did his normal campaign speech, you know, America will not get ripped off again, not his language, and your country wouldn't want that either. Xi Jinping then comes on board, and he talks our talk, your talk. We must together develop each other's economies. Together, we must address the challenges that, you know, hit Peru the same way as it does my country. Together, in a very statesmanlike way. In other words, he was using what the U.S. used to say. He was using that multilateral language that we like to hear. And what was interesting was that the Prime Minister of Australia was in the front row, along with the President of Peru, along with other presidents. They weren't there when Trump was speaking. And then afterwards, there was a TPP meeting. I walked by and I said, what's going on there? He said, well, it's TPP. And Xi Jinping was running it. They now have their own development fund. They are adopting the language of multilateralism. They're not saying our state enterprise model is the model, but they are using the language of all. So it is working. And, you know, I brought a group of women ministers to meet Xi Jinping when he was his vice president. Each one of them said, oh, Mr. Vice President, thank you for our parliament building. Mr. Vice President, thank you for our highways. Mr. Vice President, thank you for our ministerial building. They have invested in Africa far longer than anybody else. I sat there and I thought, oh God, U.S. is screwed. We weren't there at all. So the lines are not as clear. Maybe for public consumption, the language of multilateralism is being used by China. But China's approach is being adopted and listened to by others. And so I think it's not the lines that, you know, seem to be, so this model versus that model versus that. And I think we need to keep that in mind.
Were they sincere? Because in Punta del Este, the American speech was perfect.
It may have been for public consumption. What I'm saying is that it is being consumed. Okay?
Yeah. In words.
Yes.
Yes, please. We have 10 minutes, so we wait for the responses until we have all the questions.
Well, it's also related to what Peter and Naushad has said, among others. And it's also related to China. Well, you know, China is doing all this that I can understand, but there is a reason for that. When, let's go back 150 years, okay? Japan and China, they were pulled into international trade by force back in 1839, etc., in the name of free trade. That game was played at the time by the hegemony of the international trade, which was hegemonical power, which was Britain, which had its comparative advantage in selling those, you know, industrial products. And after that, Japan started to play the game in the same field by industrializing itself. And at the beginning of the 20th century, when, in the middle of the 20th century, when Japan wanted to enter GATT, as you know much better than me, Britain and Holland rejected it for the reason that that would be difficult for the British trade at the time, because by then, Japan had already developed its comparative advantage, and it had become very powerful in terms of competition. That's why Britain and Holland actually rejected the entry of Japan. Japan had to really compete for being admitted to GATT. Let's remember that. Now, things are in the advantage of China, which has the ultimate comparative advantage, at least for a while, in terms of cheaper labor still, and technology and everything else. That's why now a good international order is in the advantage of China, because it can sell its goods. and all this, Silk Road and Belt and everything. I have sympathy of those projects, but that is all. The behavior of China actually is very similar to the behavior of UK 150 years ago. Yeah. We have to be careful about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I give you were spoken directly addressed directly. So, Draper.
Yeah, so I'll make 2 points. One on China and the other on infant industry protection, because I did want to come back on that point. So on China, well, for me, the jury is still out. I think for the Chinese leadership, the rise of Donald Trump is a huge strategic opportunity, and clearly they're taking advantage of that. So that's the first point. The second point is what the quality of Chinese leadership will be remains to be seen. I retain some optimism that it will actually be to the benefit of the multilateral system. But I also worry about where China itself is going in terms of its domestic political arrangements and whether that can sustain leadership of a liberal international economic order. And in my mind, there's a big question mark about that longer-term future. So we'll see. But again, we're in the interregnum. It's early days. The jury's still out. Right now, nobody on the international stage really likes Donald Trump. And so we look elsewhere for leadership. And China is stepping up to the plate, and that's good. The system needs leaders. I'm not sure China is so ready to lead, actually. That's another question that we could debate for some time. And by the way, I'm not even sure what a Chinese model is. I've recently seen some research by a Princeton scholar, Singaporean, who's fluent in Mandarin, spent years studying Chinese industrial policies and interviewing and reading all the texts of various government departments, and finds that actually it's all over the place. There are so many different policies coming out of different parts of the Chinese government that whether one man, Xi Jinping, because let's remember, he has concentrated power in himself fundamentally. So can he direct this vast and very complex ship? I think the jury's out on that, and we'll be clearer down the line. Then on infant industry protection, it's great in theory. The political economy is very challenging in practice. And I really do think you have to get into the political economy if you're going to promote this. Maybe it works in India. I don't know. You're better placed to judge. Just let me finish the point. But in African circumstances, the political economy of protection, I think, is a very different logic. And you have to confront that if you're going to advocate it. Second point is market size. Right? So if you're China, India, Brazil, perhaps, you have a big domestic market. So infant industry protection may work for you. If you're Rwanda or a typical sub-Saharan African LDC, you have a very small market. Your scope for pursuing infant industry protection is necessarily limited. So you have to look for, at the very least, regional solutions. And quite often that means extending, by the way, import substitution into the region. But even the regional markets are small. We still need global markets, absolutely. Now, if you want to engage in those global markets, you have to be prepared to give something in order to receive, which means import substitution is necessarily going to be limited.
Thank you very much. That was a good intervention.
So
I think.
If I just pick up on both the points, I wonder if the multilateral system can actually benefit from precisely the China phenomenon that you mentioned just now, in that it is indeed stepping up to this role, filling a vacuum in international leadership. And these statements, yes, you could argue, are they fully genuine, etc. But why don't we just assume they are, and then say, okay, given everything that you're saying, now deliver, because China is actually one of the biggest beneficiaries of the multilateral and open trading system, and it has a direct stake, therefore, in seeing that the system stays open and accessible to its own competitive firms. So why don't we use that opening as a way of getting China to indeed play one of those leadership roles that was previously played by the West, maybe even in terms of unilateral opening up and differential opening up relative to others. Second, on the political economy side, I do agree. I mean, I think the infant industry story is very much one of working when, why did it work in South Korea? Why did it work in Taiwan? It worked in those two countries because the political economy, it was pretty, they had at that time pretty authoritarian rule that went ahead with opening up even when their firms argued strongly that they shouldn't. That wiped out the Taiwanese car industry, for example, in the 70s. And simply because they said they would open up in a particular time frame. So I wonder if we can address the political economy question also by framing international rules in the multilateral system that specifies periods of time. So that specifies how long such tariffs could actually be used by any country, regardless of its start point. And that, in a way, one could almost use that. You can, one of the domestic political compulsions can sometimes be nicely addressed by blaming an external source for having to do something that you know is the right thing to do, but which may not be politically expedient in the short run.
Thank you very much. I think that was useful. I just have one comment. Quite frankly said, I'm not sure I would feel comfortable China defining the rules of the 21st century. I would prefer to have a combination of China with somebody else. I think that's very necessary. We don't want to go to a one-polar system again. I think the last point, I think also is a very important one, and I think that's one of the problems with the multilateral system is, in the past, we have used the international rules to do what we thought was possible, but was politically difficult. Mm-hmm. And now it is considered, like most African countries says, we are willing to do it, but we are not willing to take the commitment, multilateral. I think that's a completely different way of looking at what is the use of the system. The system is supposed to help us to do what we know we have to do and not be a constraint to development. Yes, Deb.
Nicolas. You see,
you're not happy anymore.
Monday morning having those fundamental discussions. Now you have, from differentiation, you have come up to the infant industry argument. That's really, really interesting.
That's down. That's going down.
Okay. And talking about the multilateral system, we ended up discussing China. So it's very interesting. I think it's symptomatic in that way. Now let me make 1 or 2 points from listening to my very erudite colleagues. Start with Peter. Peter, you mentioned there is no shared understanding of development. I strongly, fundamentally disagree with that. Because only 2 years back, we have signed the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda. People may not take it seriously in Geneva, but the rest of the world takes it very seriously. And they are implementing that. And what is the vision of that development? It is about transformation. It is universal. It is inclusive. It is integrated. So you have something which is based on human rights, that everybody has the access or a right to have development, which has to be very inclusive, which will transform the economies, both in terms of productive capacity and employment, and it will be integrated, including the economic, social, and the environmental dimensions, and with the rule of law with Goal 16. So I think we do have a global vision about the world for the next 15 years. Everybody signed after it. Changes in government should not really deter the countries moving out of it in that way. So I think that what we need to do is not bring the vision to the trade, but to bring trade to that vision, how it really sticks with that. And this is one major issue, which is now being debated very strongly with the voluntary national reviews going around, and why the trade issue is not really being flagged into the voluntary national review properly, and the diplomats are being taken to task. So that's one point. The second point relating to this interregnum, how you really define it. Again, Peter put it as a clash of two economic model, if not political systems. I think that's a very old-fashioned dichotomous framework. I think that is very old-fashioned because it is, if you look at it, at the basic of it is that some big powers are losing comparative advantage in the trade policies, if not competitive advantage. That is the problem. That it is not about policies, state capitalism or the others. That's very, I agree partly on those elements, but not necessarily all the trade interregnum is really associated with it. The old does not want to let go, but has lost their comparative advantage. That is the reality. It is not that they have lost the moral superiority as a democratic institution, but the market has determined that they have lost the comparative advantage. They cannot use the old institutions anymore to protect that particular part, and that's why we are paralyzing the institution. We have paralyzed the system, trading system, multilateral trading system. Then we have paralyzed the WTO Doha mechanism. Now we are really killing the jewel in the crown, the appellate body. You see how it is transiting. And what we will really end up with, we will possibly end up with something that which is totally new maybe. It is now one will have to really launch a Save WTO campaign. Make WTO relevant again. If WTO does not remain relevant, life will go on. Life will go on, and as we see. And the new WTO which will come in, possibly you will have another session here, maybe somewhere else, redefining what is SNDT. The SNDT to be preserved for the OECD countries for agriculture. SNDT to be preserved for United States, North Carolina for textiles. SNDT to be preserved for fisheries subsidies for Japan. We may really, after 10 years, totally turn around and discuss an SNDT totally in a different light as we are going to proceed. So my whole point to you is that the discussion which we are having today is totally, to me, still has a long overcast of the 1990s, 2010. It really does not really speak to the others in that way. Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers. The South-South trade has crossed 50%. You have the FDI crossing those numbers from the South. You have the other, the import demands as it coming from over there. The recent improvement in the global economic circumstances was much higher in case of the southern economies, even Africa in certain extent, in certain ways. So if you look at the future, so the issue which I'd like to end by saying that for many of the LDCs in the future or for the developing economies in the future, will of course be not so much of duty-free, quota-free market access for merchandise. It will be merchandise trade. It will be more about services and the services in relation to the value chain. And more importantly, the issue which is coming out very strongly in our part of the world is the issue of technology and productivity growth. And we need something which will come forward, a totally new agenda on having a much more better access, not only a technology access or intellectual property right regime trading issues, not only in case of TRIPS, but in case of other issues, including e-commerce and other over there. So the agenda is changing very much along with those interregnum. I really look forward to be present in that session, which you're going to convene.
Thank you very much. I will be dead by that period, but we are very optimistic about hoping that everything is going to change. I think it will change, but not that fast. But I mean, we have to finish up. I thank everybody, and I think we have obviously not necessarily found solutions, but I think we have crystallized some of the problems that we have to look at, and I am sure that those guys there at the Hilton are going to ignore very well whatever we have said here. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to the panelists for having come and had a very open and constructive discussion.